Hello and welcome to the Space Madness Podcast. This is your host, Jeff Nosanov. And today we have a guest who I haven't been able to really chat with for over 10 years, so I'm excited to reconnect with him. His name is Will Pomerantz. And if you're in the space business, you've probably heard his name. He's had a lot of interesting roles in different places. But one of the most intriguing ones to me was his involvement with the Mars helicopter on the last rover, and on the sample system of the latest rover. And he did so through a series of non-NASA roles, which is one of my favorite kinds of stories to tell, because you don't really imagine that is possible until you go out and do it like Will did. So thank you, Will, for being with me today.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me on. It's a delight to see you again.
Likewise. So I think the best way to start is to kind of state the current role that you're in at AeroVironment, how that connects with the missions that are ongoing right now. Then we'll go all the way back like I always do.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm the head of space ventures at AeroVironment. We go by AV usually. AV is primarily not a space company. We're a defense and a terrestrial drones company. We're the number one supplier of drones to the U.S. Department of War, and most of what the business is building cool flying things for terrestrial applications. But we had the really wonderful opportunity and the big honor of partnering with JPL and some of your former colleagues at JPL and across NASA to work on Ingenuity, the first aircraft to ever fly on another world. All the development of that was done before I joined the team, so I feel like I could brag about it without throwing out my shoulder or patting myself on the back. I'll compliment my wonderful team. We have a great history at AV of working on kind of wild, weird, funky, and incredible vehicles. The way the company was started was our founder, Paul McCready, who has since passed away, but still very much part of the history of the organization and the current DNA of the organization. He had found out about this international competition, sort of an X Prize style competition called the Creamer Prizes, which were for human-powered flight. And these prizes had stood for, decades at this point, in addition to human-powered flight having been a dream of humans pretty much as long as there have been humans. And he was an engineer and friends with other engineers who were really into sort of hyper efficiency and lightweighting of structures and materials, and said, let's go out and we'll win this little prize. He I think had made a family loan that went bad or something like that. He was in need of a little bit of cash.
Okay.
And so that seemed like an easy way to win cash. And then lo and behold, went out and did the dang thing. So built a series of vehicles called the Gossamer Condor and the Gossamer Condor and the Gossamer Albatross. They're hanging in the Smithsonian now, and were truly fully human-powered vehicles. One of them flew a big figure eight, across multiple kilometers, and then one of them crossed the English Channel on the power of
are those the pedal-powered?
They're the pedal-powered.
Gliders?
You're exactly
Okay.
right. Basically, you get a very lightweight, strong cyclist, almost like a jockey, right? You want someone who doesn't weigh very much, but has great endurance and great leg strength and can pilot this thing, and went out and won the prize, I think, to the great surprise of the folks in the UK who were offering the competition and just about everyone else. So transitioned from that to putting solar panels on the upper skin of those aircraft and doing some of the early solar powered aircraft, won the first ever solar car challenge. Those kinds of things transitioned to work with NASA in the 90s and 2000s on what are called HAPS, high altitude persistent stratospheric flight, or high altitude pseudo satellites. The airplanes that you and your podcast fans may have seen that are basically giant flying wings with solar panels all along the upper skin. Through that program, we actually hold the altitude record for sustained flight here on Earth. We've flown at more than 96,000 feet. And so when some of the brilliant folks at NASA JPL started dreaming up this idea of a Mars helicopter, they wanted an aviation partner who had some familiarity with flying in really thin atmospheres. And it turns out that flight at 96,000 feet here on Earth, the atmospheric densities that you're seeing up there are pretty similar to what you see at flying at ground level in some of the locations on Mars.
Wow.
So he had reached out to AV again way before I was on the team and just sort of said, hey, you want to talk about Mars helicopters together? And I think any engineer, worth his or her salt would say yes to that question.
Yeah. Wow.
We started working on cool early prototypes, never thinking it would fly, and self-funding things really, that JPL folks were funding their own work and brought such wonderful expertise in addition to facilities and things like that, all the Mars expertise. Really sort of combined, our peanut butter and their chocolate, or whatever's the right analogy there. Our skills really complemented each other really well, long enough to develop the idea and help a few key figures at NASA fall in love with it.
Sure.
Which, much to everyone's surprise, eventually resulted in Ingenuity being a real mission.
Yeah. Now, if I recall, I think I left JPL right when it got serious, but I recall it was, well, at least what I heard is it was the brainchild of Charles Alachi, or at least he was a major voice in support. Is that what?
You're
Can you tell me
exactly
about
right. He
that
was he
story?
was a
Okay.
major voice in
Okay.
support, and had a
Okay.
nice sort of ping ponging back and forth. I think Dr. Alachi, the longtime
Mm,
legendary head of JPL,
mm,
uh, was seeing some of the things that JPL and the broader NASA community were doing with terrestrial drones, and had
mm.
come to his team at JPL and sort of said, "Hey, do you think we could ever do that on Mars?" And the
Sure.
gut reaction, of course, of everyone is no. There's just not
Yeah.
enough atmosphere there. But as
Yeah.
people, go back and sharpen the pencil and look at it a little bit
Mm,
more, I mainly point to a gentleman named Bob Ballaram, who recently retired from JPL. I would call
yes.
him sort of the father of ingenuity,
Mm,
father of the Mars drone concept. He was the one who sort of kept carrying it on, partnering
mm,
with engineers both at JPL and at AeroVironment, starting to reach out to folks on the science team at JPL like
mm.
Matt Golenbeck and saying, "Hey, what could you do? Where would you want to go? What kind of
Sure.
instruments would you want to put on board?" What became Ingenuity was originally proposed as a science instrument to fly along with the Mars
Uh,
2020 mission, and it was not selected for that because the technology wasn't viewed as mature
oh,
enough. But
okay.
Dr. Alachi sort of had the bug, and he said, "This is such a cool idea, and yeah, it might not work, but hey, we work at a place where the motto is dare mighty things, right?
Right.
We should give it a try.
Yeah.
The fact that it might not work isn't reason not to
Yeah.
attempt it." So he kept sort of plugging at it, and was eventually able to find some other really wonderful advocates, folks like
Mm,
Thomas Uken, folks like Jim Bridenstine,
mm.
folks like Bobby Braun, enough folks who said, "Yeah, that is really cool. And I don't know if it'll work, but it's worth placing a small bet on what might be a revolutionary technology if
Yeah.
we can make it work."
Among the details coming back to me now is that the whole thing weighed less than 1 pound or kilogram.
Ingenuity was like 1.7 kilograms. I mean, it's a
Okay.
tiny vehicle.
Yeah.
As by definition, anything that's going to fly on Mars will always be. There is very
Yeah.
little atmosphere there. And so every additional gram that you put on your
Hmm.
helicopter just makes it that much harder to fly. And again, that's why the AeroVironment, the AV to JPL connection made so much sense. If
Right.
you've worked on human powered aircraft as your first project, you are
Yeah.
always dealing in a world where every gram really, really matters, even more so than it does to most airplane and spacecraft
Right.
manufacturers. So
Right.
that sort of fundamental philosophy that was ingrained in all of us was just what was required for a mission like
Yeah.
that.
I mean, above and beyond the usual space grams, kilograms mattering. I mean, which is already pretty strict.
It's already pretty strict.
Yeah.
Space mass is expensive. Mass to
Yeah.
space is expensive.
Yeah.
So people definitely have the incentive to think about every kilogram, but often not about every gram. That is
Yeah.
extreme, even in the rocket business, even in the
Fair.
spacecraft business. But it was really what was needed to get something off the ground on Mars.
Yeah. Well, so I think you and I could keep going on this, but I want to ask the question, how did you get there? What's the
Yeah.
90s the
So
90s sitcom? So you're probably wondering how I got here, opening.
so I came after Ingenuity was already on the surface of Mars. So my colleagues had gotten this phone call saying, "Hey, these things that we've been sort of tinkering around with, would you like to do it for real?" To which the answer
Mm,
is an easy absolutely.
yeah.
It came with a caveat attached of, we don't have a whole lot of money and we don't have hardly any time. So we got to build it
Hmm.
really, really fast. It was something like an 18-month turnaround from that phone call to delivering flight hardware,
Wow.
24 months or so to launching it, a little less than that, I
Yeah.
think. So a really, really fast turnaround. Got to Mars. At the time, my wife was working at JPL
Hmm.
on the Perseverance rover. And so I got to view it from the perspective of someone who has a planetary science degree as a former Martian geologist who had gone into
Hmm.
aerospace, sort of commercial space, into the business side, but also seeing it through the lens of an engineer, an aerospace engineer who
Yeah.
was on operations side at JPL. And I
Whose
think
job it
that
is to make it work.
whose job it is to make it work. And I
Yeah.
remember asking my wife and a bunch of her colleagues as Perseverance and Curiosity were arriving at Mars and
Mm,
as they were getting ready to deploy the helicopter on the surface and do the first flight. I remember sort of asking them after hours, "Okay, you're not on camera right now. This is not for
yeah.
attribution. What do you think are the chances that this helicopter will fly?" And pretty
Yeah.
much universally, the answer was no way.
Really.
No
Okay.
chance that thing's going to, maybe
Okay.
it'll take off. There's no
Yeah.
way it's going to fly in a controlled fashion. There just
Uh,
isn't enough atmosphere.
hmm.
And we've done this so quickly. There
Yeah.
was a lot of testing that went into making sure that the helicopter wouldn't damage the rover.
Right. And I believe it actually was not allowed to fly anywhere near it ultimately,
Correct.
right? Okay.
correct? Because you don't want your little tech demo
Yeah.
to do some damage to your $2.5 billion,
Right.
exquisite science laboratory on wheels. But
Yeah.
beyond that, they hadn't done the traditional amount of testing that you would do for the rover on the helicopter because it
Sure.
was a tech demo. It didn't
Right.
need to survive for years. It wasn't carrying exquisite science instruments. Its mission was take off and land. And if you've done
Yeah.
that once, you have made
Yeah.
history and you
Yeah.
have definitively proven that it is possible to fly on Mars. So goal was one flight. Stretch
Mm.
goal was 5 flights.
Hmm.
When I came on board, we were at flight number 50 or so. And this had gone from
Okay.
being a can it to,
Yeah.
oh, it can. And now what do you do
Yeah.
with it? Right.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
had a chance to see the science team that operate the Perseverance rover, the wonderful engineering team at JPL that send commands up every day, had a chance to go through that learning curve of,
Mm.
okay, at first we were just focused on simple up and down, show that it works.
Yeah.
And then we'll sort of get a little fancier, but then got to the point where they were starting to realize, hey, actually this little scout that flies
Mm.
makes a really good buddy to the science laboratory on wheels, right? It doesn't carry all the instruments, but it moves really fast. It moves really far
Mm.
per flight. It can cover ground that would be way too hazardous to send a rover on. You don't have to worry
Yeah.
about cracking the wheels as you drive over
Yeah.
a short rock. And so
Again.
every day, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We learned that lesson the hard way as a community. And so they would realize every day, hey, if our science team are sort of arguing amongst themselves about should we turn left or should we turn
Mm.
right today, it's really nice to be able to send the helicopter left and right and both say, hey, is the place that seems like it might be more hazardous, but also maybe more interesting, is it actually interesting enough to justify it? And oh,
Yeah.
by the way, if it is, now we have downward facing photography of the entire
Mm.
thing, and we can go and plan out how to get there
Mm.
safely, how to get there safely quickly. And so really it makes
Yeah.
our rover that much more efficient. So that was exciting. So had gotten people really interested in it. NASA, as you alluded to, had put JPL and ourselves under contract to build 2 more helicopters that were called the sample recovery helicopters that were
Mm.
part of the Mars sample return architecture. Just sort of saying, hey,
Yeah.
we know these helicopters can work. We sort of
Right.
newly have this need to get the samples that are being collected by the Perseverance rover, and so just to physically move them from wherever they are
Yeah.
to load them into an ascent vehicle to come back. And so
Mm.
when I came on board, we had Ingenuity on the surface of Mars. We're under contract to build these next 2 helicopters, and I was brought in to sort of manage the team on successful
Mm.
execution of those, and then to go and help sort of plant the seeds that would turn into the next helicopter mission,
Sure.
and hopefully turn this into kind of a recurring manufacturing line for Mars drones.
Yeah.
We're not
Yeah.
going to get to the tens of thousands of units that we do maybe for our terrestrial drones, but it'd be nice to go
Yeah.
beyond 1 and go beyond
Sure.
3 and have these things sort of flying at every opportunity,
Yeah.
which was kind of a dream job, for someone who, like I said, I have a degree in planetary science. In my very, very brief planetary science career, I was a Martian geology guy, and I
Mm.
left that field because at the time when I left, and I left in the early 2000s, it was a field where if you were really lucky, maybe you'd get to work on 2 missions over the course of your entire career. The
Yeah.
Mars missions that we have done are amazing. There just aren't that many of them, right? They take a long time to
Right.
develop. They operate for a long time. They're quite expensive to develop. And so you always knew, I get maybe 2, 3 if I'm really lucky in this field. And I'm always 1 bad day away from going from 2 down to 1 or 1 down to 0.
Yeah.
Whether that's,
Yeah.
a rocket doesn't do what it was supposed to, or a spacecraft doesn't do what it's supposed to, or a politician changes their mind and a program
Yeah.
gets canceled.
Yeah.
And I, looking at, as a very young person, just starting my career, looking at that as like the best case scenario, I sort of
Mm.
said, you know what, maybe that's not the field for me. So I went back to school. I went to a place called the International Space University. I got
Mm.
another degree, and I decided, hey, maybe my role, instead of being one of the people analyzing the data coming back from another world, maybe my role is to help there be more data coming back from other worlds
Sure.
by finding ways to make it so spaceflight is not so rare, it is not so expensive and
Yeah.
exclusive to just a few nations with the biggest budgets out there. How do we make
Mm.
it so there are smaller kind of bite-sized missions where we can take more
Yeah.
shots on goal, where we can iterate a little bit more quickly, where we can open the door to the crazier sounding ideas, not
Mm.
just the ones that are most sure to work, and really help
Yeah.
that data flow out to future generations of planetary scientists or any other discipline.
Yeah. And to have the platforms more plentiful so that you can take more risks with them instead of everything being a one shot must win. This reminds me of the the early aviation world before World War One, most nations had not really embraced it until someone realized, hey, we can deliver mail with these things. And it was actually the mail delivery. Oh, the people must know that at AeroVironment, but it was actually mail delivery in World War One that just exploded the field. That hey, this is actually worth large scale investments.
Amen.
So
And we sort of
yeah,
find our equivalents in space. And that's
yeah,
hard to do when it's, costs $1 billion to sit down at the table,
right,
as it
right,
historically has, even though those missions, in my opinion, are totally worth it. But if that's the
yeah.
only category mission, almost everyone is priced out of it. You gotta have the smaller table stakes as well.
Right. I mean, and we're in this very exciting time where the cost of trying has become really lower than I think any of us dared hope for in the first half of our lives. So it's a good time to be trying all this stuff. So where'd you go from ISU? I know your story, I think, from X Prize on, but I don't think I know the in between.
Yeah, so I went back to ISU because I knew I loved space. I knew I
Mm.
didn't want to do the thing my undergraduate degree was in, which was sort
Yeah,
of a whoops, uh-oh. But I don't want to go that far. And so I was sort of
sure.
thinking about, well, do I want to do engineering? Do I want to do business? Do I want to do policy
Hmm.
and law? I'm interested in all these things.
Hmm.
I've been in clubs that do all these things, but I don't
Yeah,
have a degree in them. So let me go figure out what I wanted. And to me, ISU was the perfect place for that.
sure.
It's a 1-year master's program. It's international, intercultural, interdisciplinary. And so I got a chance to learn at least the basics, the vocabulary, the key
Hmm.
formulas, the who's who of every single space field, and then
Yeah,
also how to teach yourself more and who you might want to follow up with to, as a mentor or as an employer or as a
sure.
historical example. And that was just what, was absolutely the perfect thing for me. I discovered, for better or worse, I like doing a little bit of everything. I am not a narrow and deep guy. I'm more of a broad and shallow kind of
Mm.
guy. At least that's where I found that my skills stood out more from the rest of the crowd.
I can relate. Yeah.
I learned early on that if you, give a room full of people a blank sheet of paper and you need to go from nothing to pretty good really fast, I
Hmm.
am stronger at that, relatively
Sure,
speaking, than I am at taking something that's already pretty good and getting it to excellent.
sure, sure.
I could do that, but I don't really stand out from the crowd in that part in quite the way
Yeah,
that I do at go from a total stop to fairly knowledgeable about
right.
that pretty quickly. And so emerging from grad school, trying to figure out how to turn that into a career path,
Hmm.
how do you get hired in your first job as more of a generalist is a little bit challenging, right? People
Yeah.
want folks who are going to do a deep dive into the exact thing that they're paying you to do. So for me, the first stop was in consulting. I worked at a
Okay.
boutique aerospace consultancy called Futron. It does not exist under that name anymore, but folks who are familiar with companies like Bryce Tech or
Hmm.
Avocent are both sort of emerged from Futron
Okay.
or were sister companies or in the same kind of space there. And again, that was a really wonderful place because I got to, on any individual project, I would have to do a narrow and deep dive.
Sure.
But as a consultant, I could have 4 or 5 different projects at the same time. And so I could be
Mm.
learning about different parts of the industry, working for commercial customers and government customers, state government and federal government customers,
Yeah.
starting to see patterns of where was everybody having a hard time, what kind of data was everyone most hungry for, was really the most interesting thing for me. And so I was at Futron for only about a year when I happened to find myself, much to my own surprise, kind of doing a job interview with a guy named Peter Diamandis, who had founded ISU. So I met him mainly
Right.
through the
Of
ISU
course.
connection.
Yeah.
But he'd also founded X Prize among 100 other places. He's a
Yeah.
true serial entrepreneur. And this was at a time when the original X Prize had just been awarded. I had
Mm.
been a volunteer, writing articles on the website X
Mm.
Prize Foundation during the original Ansari X Prize and the flights of Spaceship One. And Peter, who had
Oh,
created this nonprofit.
before you go on,
Yeah,
it was this flight of Spaceship One in July of 2004 that I was already a
gotcha.
space nut, but that for
Yep,
me was like, okay, I finished college in 2004. I got to find a way into this.
yep.
Here we are 22
I
years
love that
later.
story, and I hear it a lot from
Yeah.
people our age,
Yeah.
right? It's the
Yeah.
thing that either turns something from a kind of cool, I admire that field, to a
Yeah.
personal connection to I could work in that
Yeah.
field, or just sort of unlocked a whole new set of career
Yeah.
paths.
And I was on a plane in Europe watching it live on a plane, which itself was pretty remarkable in
Yeah,
2004. So it was like,
yeah, that's
what else?
fantastic.
Okay. Boom. Done. Back to
I
you.
love it. So Peter had created the X Prize Foundation, the nonprofit entity that operated that
Mm.
prize, really as a one-off, just to operate that first
Mm.
prize, which, was another one of these crazy ideas. It'll never work. People would laugh about it. It was sort of a,
Yeah.
circus act right up until the moment when it wasn't. And all of a
Sure.
sudden it was extremely serious and it was the future. And it woke a lot of people up. It got a lot of people excited who might not have been otherwise. And it took some of the folks who had sort of hard-won cynicism from a long time in the industry. And it was like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe we need to go back and re-examine a couple of these things there. But because Peter had created the organization just to do that prize, he was shutting it down. Mission accomplished. We're getting ready to sunset out of the organization. And a few of the donors had come to him and said, Peter, your crazy idea worked. You should be growing, not shrinking.
Yeah.
And so some big names in the tech world had come to him and given him a little bit of money and said, okay, go figure out what the next X Prize should be. Yeah. And Peter was looking for talented, bright, creative young people who were willing to work for pennies 24 hours a day because they were in love with what they were doing, who would come in and figure out what the next X Prizes would be. And I was fortunate enough that he wanted me to be the guy to come in and figure that out for space, while the foundation also looked to expand into other fields like genome sequencing and automotive fuel efficiency and nanotechnology and education, lots of other spaces there. So I got to go to X Prize. I ended up being there for about 6 years, running a competition for NASA first called the Northrop Grumman Lunar Lander Challenge, which was for vertical takeoff and vertical landing rocketry. Before that was cool, at a time when that had only been done by the Apollo LEM, really, and the Delta Clipper program, and that was it. And then we sort of leveraged that into what became the Google Lunar X Prize. So to take a terrestrial demonstration of vertical takeoff and lunar lander type vehicles, and to translate that into actually delivering robotics systems to the lunar surface, which was a ton of fun to go there and sort of be around, the startup world, the space startup world, but especially this kind of crazy maverick, out of the box thinkers. I think there's probably like a law of nature that says you can't compete for an X Prize type thing and be a boring person. You need to have this right mix of brilliance in an unconventional way and a little bit of ego, but a little bit of a big picture view of the world, like all this nice gumbo of different ingredients.
Imagine the first primate to use a stick as a tool. It probably rubbed the other primates the wrong way because he was doing something out of the ordinary. The ordinary being what kept you alive.
Right.
I mean, I think this goes way back, but I want to, you're making me realize, I haven't thought about the X Prize in a long time, that's now the model of innovation at half the federal agencies that do science and technology, right? Is they have prizes, or at least even more remarkably, there's actually contract law changes that enabled that.
Yep.
So that is almost more amazing that the federal government came up with a new way to do procurement than the actual results themselves, because that's almost harder. It's so effective.
Sure was. And hats off to the people, NASA and DARPA, I think, were at the forefront of that. NASA created a program called Centennial Challenges, very much in direct response to the X Prize. In fact, there's a wonderful former NASA leader named Steve Isakowitz, who many years later would be a boss of mine when I worked for Virgin. He, at the time, I forget his exact title, but he was a deputy associate administrator at NASA, something along those lines. And he had a teenage son who came up to him one day with a copy of a physical printed newspaper that had a picture of Spaceship One on the front of it, and put it on the table in front of his dad and said, in that way that only teenagers can, "Hey, Dad, how come you never do anything cool like this?" Which, as a senior executive at the most beloved space agency and government agency of any kind of the world, I imagine Steve got a wry chuckle out of it.
That's great.
But then was able to go and take that and talk to some more visionary folks on Capitol Hill and at NASA and say, hey, this method of incentivizing research and development, not just write a traditional request for proposals or a BAA or something like that, and go and have people submit bids and pick one or two winners and fund them to try. To rather to kind of do the opposite of that and just hang a carrot at the end of the stick and say, hey, this is the thing we want. Whoever does it first gets the money. It doesn't matter if your idea seemed like an idiotic one or anywhere in between.
Yeah.
Doesn't work for everything. It doesn't scale up infinitely. There's some fields where it's just too hard. People need the money up front. But boy, when it works, it really works.
Well, one of the prizes I responded to was the Space Toilet Prize. And I was so enchanted with the challenge that that's probably the thing I put in the most work in that I had really knew nothing about to start with. Just because what a cool story it would be to say that I contributed to space toilets in some way. I don't think I did, but it certainly captured my imagination.
It does exactly that, right? It worms its way into people's brains, into creative people's brains. And then also it means that you're trying 10 or 20 different technology avenues in parallel.
Right.
And so you don't have to decide in front, this is a good idea and this is a bad idea. You're allowed to be wrong about that.
Yeah.
You talked earlier about the importance of mail, of the postal service in the early advent of aviation. I sort of connecting these dots, thinking about Charles Lindbergh. The reason that Charles Lindbergh was able to fly across the Atlantic and became sort of the legendary figure in aviation that he did was to win an X Prize type competition called the Orteig Prize, which was the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris in either direction without stopping by an aircraft. If you looked at the competitors going for that, if you'd had, an ESPN style power rankings of the competitors that are going for that, you had all of the most famous aviators of the day.
Okay.
And then at the very bottom of the list, you would have had this Charles Lindbergh nobody guy.
Oh, interesting.
He was a junior pilot on a mail route out of St. Louis. This before St. Louis was an aviation, town. He's the reason St. Louis became an aviation town. And so if Raymond Orteig, instead of offering a prize, had just done a standard call for proposals and issued a research grant, no way in hell it would have gone to Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah.
20 other people would have had to drop out of the running before they would have even read his proposal. But he had the right idea and he had the right team and he had the right grit and perseverance and all the right things where he was the one who sort of crossed the finish line.
Yeah. I mean, that really speaks to that continuous human nature across time. And speaking of time, I didn't ask you about your earliest space experience, the experience that really cemented in you. This is what I'm going to do. So I'd love to hear that story. I should have started with it, but better late than never.
So, I mean, I liked space as a kid in the way that everyone likes space as a kid. And I, had pictures of Saturn up on the wall and I have vague impressions of Challenger, but don't remember it all that clearly. I would have been in first grade, I think, at the time. So
I was 4.
It is somewhere in there as a sense memory, but not as a crystal clear thing.
Yeah.
But I never really connected space to myself, certainly not as this could be my job until I was in college. Even though I moved around a lot as a kid, I lived in Houston a little bit. I lived in Orlando a little bit. So 2 big space towns where, you can sort of see space shuttles launch from downtown Orlando. And you probably know somebody who works at Johnson here in Texas or at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. But for some reason, it just never worked its way into my brain as a thing that I could do. So it wasn't until college. I went to college knowing that I wanted to be a scientist, being sort of interested in all the sciences equal. Remember, most of your listeners and viewers will recall, if you think back to your first semester of your freshman year, semester of any year, it's when all the clubs on campus are all recruiting all the new students. And I remember I was walking through the main science building on my college campus and I saw a sign taped to a door that said there was the introductory meeting of an organization called SEDS, the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space.
Cool.
And the meeting was starting in about 5 minutes in the room that I was standing outside the door of. And I still remember to this day sort of thinking like, I like space,
Yeah.
I checked out an a cappella group this morning and I might go to the, to look at rowing crew tomorrow. Like I'll check out this space club because I'm here. And went in and I really liked the people in the club and I really liked the activities they were doing. And I joined the space club and it was SEDS that totally opened my eyes to like, space is an actual, it's an industry. It's kind of a lot of industries actually all smushed together.
Yeah.
And I can take my love of science and my childhood fascination with space and science fiction and lots of other fields. And whether I want to do chemistry or physics or bio, all of these things have relevance to history.
Yeah.
So that was definitely the eye-opening moment for me. It was, I can actually turn this thing from a kind of isn't this fun? Let's be imaginative. Take some time to expand my brain in this way to no, actually this does connect a very practical way to other things that I care about.
Yeah, I again, I relate to that. I think that it felt like it became an option around the same age, for me, it was the finishing college age, as opposed to a curiosity. Now, speaking of education, let's talk about the fellowship, because I know that is close to your heart. I want to make sure we get to it. So where does that stand now?
Yeah. So I have the great honor of being a co-founder of a couple different fellowship programs that are all about getting more young people, specifically more undergraduates, involved in the space industry. One is called the Brooke Owens Fellowship. One is called the Patty Gray Smith Fellowship. And actually, in many ways, in addition to being inspired by the people for whom they are named, my personal involvement in those really ties back to that moment I was just telling you about.
Okay.
and recognizing one reason I've always loved doing education and outreach at the undergraduate level
Mm,
specifically is that to me is the age where you can teach a young person about something and they can put that knowledge into action immediately.
mm.
You know,
Old
I've
enough,
got
but young
young
enough.
kids
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's fun to do education and outreach at the elementary school level. And it's important because that's what inspires them to sort of realize that they can be anything and
Yeah.
to embrace a love of math or
Yeah.
science, even if that maybe isn't socially the most popular thing at that season of their life. But you can't really draw a straight line between, we launched a
Right.
model rocket in third grade and I had this job
Yeah.
just because so many other things happen
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
broad arc of history. Whereas an undergrad, you can have a great conversation with them and they can email you back the next night saying, I changed my major,
Yeah. Oh, I
or I
love it.
applied for this scholarship, or
Yeah.
I applied for this internship. You can make a connection to someone who becomes their boss.
Right.
That's,
Well,
I've always
it's
thought like the kind of the gear ratio of the time that
mhm.
you spend talking to an undergrad is just so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And now that I think back to all the talks I've given, I don't think I've ever given a talk at a college, but I have given them from 5 years old to 95 years old. I gave one talk at a nursing home. And if you
Okay.
know anyone who runs one or works in one, they're always looking for interesting speakers. And I didn't think I should be the one speaking. These were people who were adults when Sputnik happened. There was one guy
Okay.
who was older than the rocket equation. I mean, I felt like I should be asking them questions. And so to tell them about things that flowed from those events so early in their life was really a unique experience. I highly recommend it to any kind of space,
I
space
love
people
it.
like us who just talk forever. So how many people has the
Yeah, so the Brooke Owens Fellowship has been around the longest.
okay,
Brooke Owens was a classmate of mine at ISU, and then we were
okay,
colleagues at X Prize, a very close
mm,
personal friend. She was a bridesmaid at my wedding, who passed away way too young. She died of breast cancer in the summer of 2016. And a few folks who we actually weren't all that close to each other, but we were all very close with Brooke.
mm,
So myself and a woman named Cassie Lee, who at the time was running
mm,
space for Paul Allen, who was the, I think,
okay,
sixth or
yeah,
seventh richest person in the world at the time. And then another woman named Lori Garver, who had been the number
mm,
2 person at NASA for, the first half of the
mm.
Obama administration. We all knew Brooke, even if we didn't know each
Oh,
other
I
all that
see.
well. We wanted to do
Okay,
something to honor her memory. And we came together to create this program. So our first class was the class of 2017.
hmm,
Our original goal had been to have 12 fellows that summer
okay,
and then to sort of go back to our normal lives. We thought if we could
mm,
do that, we would have done something to help the industry and to honor our friend. And then we were busy
mm,
people and we were going to go on. So lo and behold, here we are, 10 years later. We've had 400 and something folks go through the
wow,
Brooke Owens Fellowship. But there have also been 6 other programs built on that Brooke Owens Fellowship model, including the Patty Gray
okay,
Smith Fellowship that I co-founded. I think if you add them up, there have been about 900 students,
wow,
mainly in the US, but we've had a spin-off program in Canada and one in the UK, both on a
okay,
very similar model. 900 overwhelmingly from underserved demographics. So
okay,
some of those programs have a specific demographic focus:
uh-huh,
women and non-binary students, other gender minorities for Brooke Owens Fellowship, Black and African American students for the Patty Gray Smith Fellowship, and several others. Not all of them have a demographic focus,
sure,
but some of them do. So we've been able to bring in a lot of people who I don't think would have been in the industry otherwise, not because they didn't
okay,
have the talent, not because they
right,
didn't have the interest, just because they came from communities where either they weren't exposed to the fact that there are jobs in this field,
yeah,
or where they didn't have the classic things on their resumes. They
sure,
demonstrated just as much talent, but in a different
mhm,
kind of way because they came from a community where they didn't have a rocket club and they didn't have a
right,
CubeSat team. And so you
right,
had to go in and say, oh, I think that your, experience with agricultural equipment, or like
mhm,
you're doing a startup out of your garage when you were in high school. Like I can see
yeah,
that the things that you have learned there, that not in a hand wavy kumbaya, everyone's great kind of way, like in a very practical sense, translate into, you could be an awesome member of our aerospace community right away. You can hit the ground
yeah,
running and contribute to a good company, to a good team, a good mission on day 2 of your internship, hit the
right,
ground running. Those folks were getting overlooked, right?
sure,
In our industry, we're really lucky in our industry. A lot of people want to work in this field. And so every
yeah,
job I've ever been at, when I post a job posting, you get a couple hundred qualified applicants. And inevitably what happens is you have a person who's not terribly familiar with the job, who's on the human resources team. And I mean, no offense to them, but just their job is
sure,
to go and source candidates for 20 jobs simultaneously.
Yeah.
keyword matching, and they're looking for feeder schools where we know
Right.
the
Right.
quality of the education in this specific discipline is great. And they're throwing out a huge amount of the applications, often without any human being having ever read them.
I think
And then they're
that point will be
passing the next year
relatable
of
to
application.
everybody.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember even, as a hiring manager who really cares very deeply about this stuff and has
Right.
tried to like study up on it. Again, every time I have a job posting, I'll get a top 20 or something from my human resources team. And the
Hmm.
amount of time that I can devote to each of the 20 candidates is pretty
Sure.
minuscule. And so you end up, even if you don't want to, you end up sort of blitzing through all the applications really, really fast. And it's
Yeah.
hard to get a sense of a person from a 2-page resume and a cover letter. It's easy to
Yeah.
pretend to be a normal person, even if you're not. It's easy to
Right. Right.
downplay
Well,
certain relevant skills or overplay certain relevant skills.
yeah. And I always hated cover letters because it's like even more the person doesn't have time to read,
Yep.
but I have to
Yep.
try. It's a
Yep.
game.
Yep.
I don't pretend to have the solution to that one.
And
So,
nowadays, with
yeah.
AI tools, like people are reading
Yeah.
them even less. And so
Right.
it becomes
Right.
about, do you know it's like, taking an SAT prep course or something like that. It's like, has someone taught you the right
Sure.
tricks that you need to play with your font
Yeah.
size and the words that are hidden in white and repeating the things in the job posting,
Yeah.
which is, not totally relevant. It shows some strategic thinking maybe, but like it
Depends
isn't
on the
really
job.
what I
Yeah.
want to be hiring for.
Right.
And so we tried to develop with these fellowships a different kind of both a recruitment style and
Hmm.
a selection style where we were able to go and find kind of the diamonds in the rough, in addition
Okay.
to the diamonds out in the open, and get
Sure.
both of the
Sure.
places in these fellowships, get them all mentors, get them all
Yeah.
community, and most importantly, help them get jobs, jobs that they've
Yes.
earned. No one needs to lower any thresholds. We don't have to,
Right.
drop the bar at all. The bar could stay just as high. In fact, could usually raise much higher than it already was, but just
Yeah.
allow them to present their talent and translate in a way where a
Right.
person in a traditional hiring rubric would say, oh, I'm actually going to read this resume now and spend a
Right.
moment thinking about it and have the light bulb go off of, yeah, it may
Hmm.
not be a school that I've recruited from before, but wow, look at everything this young person has done already. Even in
Yeah.
spite of these challenges, that is exactly what I want, building my
Right.
rocket or designing my spacecraft or writing my policies or anything else there. So it's been so rewarding because everybody wins so much from that. The companies,
Yeah.
I've lost track of how many times we've had a company call us talking about a Brooke Owens fellow or a Patty Gray Smith
Hmm.
fellow and
That's
say,
wonderful.
not only was that person the best intern we had at the company this year, that's the best intern I ever remember having in my career.
Wow.
And then we'll sort of point out, like, that's great to hear. And just so you know, they had applied for an internship 3 times that had never even gotten an interview,
Sure.
and people sort of get the light bulb going off of like,
Yeah.
okay, when I think we're having a hard time filling roles, sometimes we are just having a hard time filling roles, but
Right.
sometimes it means we're not looking at the candidates
Right.
in the
Right.
right kind of way. And I'm glad that we can help people sort of get over that activation energy hump.
Yes. And I've been following that over the years on LinkedIn, really with great respect. Thank you for doing that. So we have a little bit of time left. I wonder if you could share some observations about your time with Virgin. I know that from the outside, it didn't look like a lot was happening for a long time after the X Prize, after what appeared to be such a high. So
Yeah.
just a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I joined Virgin Galactic as an employee in 2011, early 2011.
Uh,
So that's already, almost 7 years after
yeah.
the Ansari X Prize. And for folks who don't already know the story, Virgin Galactic was created by licensing the technology that had won the original Ansari
Mm,
X Prize. So they went to Burt
okay.
Rutan and Scale Composites and Paul Allen, who had funded that effort,
Mm,
and sort of said, hey, you have a technology and no plans to commercialize it, right? Spaceship One,
mm,
after it did those prize-winning flights, it was
yeah.
retired immediately and donated to the Smithsonian.
Mm,
Paul Allen felt one way about winning the prize and showing it could be done and getting a big trophy.
interesting. Okay.
And he felt a different way about sort of the risk profile associated with
Okay.
continuing to operate that vehicle and turning it
Got
into
it.
a space line
Yeah.
operator. And then at the same time, you had Richard Branson. Richard had trademarked the name Virgin Galactic many years earlier. He
Okay.
was a guy who owned several airlines, who personally had wanted to fly to space for a long time
Mm,
and had been looking for a technology that could do it, that didn't cost
okay.
millions of dollars per flight. It wasn't
Yeah.
a Soyuz, which really was the only
Yeah.
option at the time. And so when he heard about the X Prize and he heard this team like may actually be doing that, and then stopping the technology. He sort of had a business plan in search of a technology, and they had a technology
Sure.
in search of a business
Sure.
plan. And so they'd connected, and Richard and the Virgin Group had sort of signed a deal with Paul Allen and Burt Rutan
Mm.
and that team to say, hey, if you win the prize, we'll get an exclusive license to your technology, and we'll
Okay.
pay you to develop Spaceship Two,
Yeah.
the next generation vehicle that'll be built on the same technology, but it won't just
Uh,
be a small vehicle for test pilots only. It'll be enough to
sure.
carry not only the pilots, but to pay the customers,
Sure.
to fly folks in the back who grew up inspired by Sputnik
Mm.
or Yuri Gagarin or the early flights, John Glenn, whatever it was, Neil Armstrong on the moon. There was this idea that probably there's a big pent up demand from people who have, been dreaming of going to space since
Yeah.
1957 or 1961 or whatever it was.
Mm.
And let's give them a chance to actually go and do that. Now, it turns out that scaling from a suborbital vehicle that can carry nominally 3 people, Spaceship One only
Yeah.
ever flew 1 person on board, but had ballast for the other 2,
Mm.
to a vehicle that has enough room to carry passengers and make money over the long run is a
Mm.
much harder challenge, right? So
Yeah.
it was not just make the vehicle 50% bigger and you put it in the photocopy machine and click enlarge.
Right. Yeah.
That it was like that for some parts, and it was very, very different from that for other parts.
Sure.
And so that development program took, I think, longer than certainly than the general public imagined. I have
Yeah.
to imagine much longer than Richard imagined.
Mm.
Richard's not an engineer,
Yeah.
and also Richard is not a U.S. person.
Right.
So for
Right.
guitar reasons, he wasn't
Can't
able
really
to
tell
come
them
in and do a
why.
deep dive
Yeah.
and be looking
Yeah.
over blueprints and seeing all the data in the way that you might in another kind of world. But I think also, at some level, the folks who signed up for a Virgin Galactic flight early
Mm.
on were to an extent at least, were okay with that. They'd wanted
Mm.
this since the 50s. The fact
Yeah.
that, they could see a test thing that had flown, and so they knew it
Yeah.
wasn't snake oil. And the fact that they got
Yeah.
to go along for the journey and sort of be part of the development program and
Mm.
come out to Mojave, California and see test flights and meet the engineers and meet the pilots and sit in the simulator. I think for many of them, like that was part of the appeal. I'm sure they all would
Sure.
have liked to fly sooner, but like the opportunity
Sure.
to be there, not just to show up and board a flight that you do when
Mm.
you're traveling somewhere here on Earth, but to feel like, no, I am part of a space flight program, I think
Sure.
was pretty exciting, even if, everyone if within the company was working as hard as we could to accelerate the pace of the program. So when I
Right.
joined in 2011, Virgin Galactic was still very small because, again, we'd hired
Mm.
someone else to do the technical work, the development of the
Okay.
vehicles. But the plan was always that Scale Composites was going to develop Spaceship Two and its carrier aircraft, White Knight
Mm.
2, and was going to hand Virgin Galactic a pair of vehicles, all the flight
Mm.
manuals on how to fly them, and also the blueprints on how to build more. And
Mm.
then there was at the time a joint venture between Scale Composites and Virgin Galactic called the Spaceship
Okay.
Company that was going to go and build
Mhm.
more than one of each vehicle, so you could actually properly have a fleet. And then
Yeah.
you'd have sort of Virgin Galactic as the airline that did, the sales, that did the training, that did the
Mhm.
flights, all the outreach around that, did some of the maintenance and things like that in the way that any airline on Earth has a maintenance operation. But then also where
Mhm.
you have the manufacturer, which is what builds new one, which does the heavy
Yeah.
maintenance. Every couple of years, you bring a vehicle in for the D check or wherever else it was like that. And so when I joined, although Virgin Galactic had been around on paper for 7
Mhm.
years already, it had been basically a sales team and
I
not a whole
see.
lot else for most of
Okay.
that time. And
Okay.
was just starting to staff up an organization and say, okay, like we're getting only a couple years away now from receiving these vehicles and having to fly them and maintain
Yeah.
them, and also to stand up this joint venture or daughter company that's going to have to
Mhm.
build more of these. So let's start staffing up so we can have people that are sort of shadowing the flight test program and ready
Sure.
to take it on board and run with it from there. So I got to join at an exciting time. I was employee number 41 or 42 or
Okay.
somewhere in that kind of range, depending on how you count it. And again, a lot of those folks had been marketing, sales,
Mhm.
awesome at their jobs, but doing a pretty different thing. It was fun to come in at the time where we were growing fast and saying like, okay,
Yeah.
we got to get smart in a hurry about how to do this. With a team that really liked at a personal level our friends at
Mhm.
Scale Composites, but had some different ideas about how to do things and trying to figure out how to kind of work all those things together. And I came in with this really fun title of Vice President of Special Projects, which was a
I remember
wonderful
that.
title to have
Yeah.
because it's meaningless, and it allowed me a lot of flexibility to
Uh-huh.
do really whatever was needed. It kind of went
Okay.
back to what we were talking about at the beginning with that. I'm pretty good at going from a blank sheet of paper to pretty good really fast.
Yeah.
And at a small startup that's in the early, rapid growth part of the hockey stick. Every
Mm-hmm.
day there's a new problem and every day there's a new opportunity. And you got to go
Sure.
from, I've never heard of this and we've never thought about this ever before, to, you know what, we got to understand it pretty well by the time Richard Branson checks in, tomorrow and
Sure.
asks us what's new, so that we can say, either we've identified a problem and here's how we're going to solve it, or
Mm-hmm.
we just had this cool opportunity to maybe go pursue a new thing. And here's our analysis of whether that's worth it or not. It
Mm-hmm.
was super fun to kind of get to do that. So I would be, helping with policy stuff one day, and I would be helping with engineering, technical program management one day, and I would be helping figure out a whole new product line another day, all over the map, which is
Yeah.
both what keeps me engaged and interested, and where, I could kind of shine a little bit and do things that might have been
Sure.
frightening to other folks.
So what was happening as you decided your time there was running out?
So I stayed with Virgin for 12 years. One of my jobs there was to help dream up new business lines, one of which, to my great surprise, ended up being Virgin Orbit, being a small satellite launch company. To be clear, it was not my idea originally. When I joined the company, there was there was a list of bullet points for other fields that Virgin Galactic could go
Okay.
into someday. Space hotels and moon
Mm-hmm.
bases and spacesuits and theme parks, and a really long list. And one of the ideas on it was small satellite launch vehicle. And so
Okay.
part of my job was go through that list and help us figure out, is this a good idea or a bad idea? Can we do this
Right.
in-house, or do we need to hire it out? Is now the time, or do we need to wait 10 years? And small satellite launch was one of those that before I studied it, I was pretty much a cynic on it, because at the time,
Mm-hmm.
no one was launching small satellites as anything other than free ride shares built by students
Sure.
for the most part. But as I went and looked at it alongside some incredibly talented colleagues, we sort of got wind of the small satellite revolution that
Uh,
was about to
okay.
happen. Hadn't happened
Yeah.
yet. We
Yeah.
connected with the folks who went on to found, Planet Labs and
Mm-hmm.
Spire and Hawkeye 3, like all these really cool companies that now have
Did
hundreds or thousands of satellites in orbit.
do you
We
know
got to talk
Ben?
to them when they were drawings on napkins, and to realize that they might need a ride to space in addition
Sure.
to the really cheap ride shares, which were
Sure.
important to get them technologies, that they might at some point need a dedicated ride that
Sure.
wasn't that much more expensive. They knew they were going to have to pay more for, you have to pay more for a taxi than you do for a bus. But
Sure.
there's some price at which that makes sense. And above a certain threshold, you'll just take the bus, even if it's inconvenient. We sort of
Right.
knew that if we could come in with a price tag that was okay to be more, but not that much more than the other rides that were on the market right there, and we could offer them sort of incredible flexibility to pick their launch site, pick their orbit, pick their time of day, pick their
Yeah.
everything, that we thought that would be a pretty exciting business opportunity. So that got the attention of some people, allowed us to bring in some extra money, allowed us to bring in
Mm-hmm.
some really talented folks, and start the Launcher One program, which eventually spun out and became Virgin Orbit. So I was employee number one at Virgin Orbit, which
Okay.
was a really fun opportunity. Again, it was not my idea originally, but to be around from it was a single
Yeah.
bullet point to it is a flying vehicle, and to
Right.
go through a demo flight that didn't work, and then a demo flight that did, and then serving
Yeah.
customers was really exciting. And then after I'd been there about, 11 and a half years, something like that, my wife, who's also in the aerospace industry,
Mm-hmm.
who had spent all of her career up to that point at JPL, almost all of her career at that point up to
Yeah.
JPL, applied for and was accepted as a flight director in the human spaceflight program at NASA's
Mm-hmm.
Johnson Space Center. And that was her absolute dream job.
Yeah.
We had not expected to move. We'd actually just bought a home in Southern California, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Setting ground roots there. We had young kids, but she got that dream job position.
Sure.
And so we picked up and moved for that. And for me, it was a good opportunity to say, you know what, I still really like my job at Virgin. I love the people I'm with. I
Yeah.
have some belief in the mission of this. But also, I've had so much fun doing this. I can't imagine my future is going to be more fun than my past, because the bar is so high. I've gotten to do all these
Yeah.
like wild and amazing things. And we've gone through there is no feeling quite like the first time a new rocket works,
Mm.
right? And we've done that. And then we had it work again, and we got to prove it wasn't a
Yeah.
fluke a couple more times. And every mission is full of joy and special, but it's
Right.
not quite the same. So it was a good
Sure.
opportunity to say, you know what, I've done the things that I wanted to do. And
Yeah.
let me ride off into the sunset here and go find the next equally cool
Well,
thing, which turned out to be
well,
Mars helicopters.
yeah. Well, that fantastic, and that really does kind of bring us full circle. So, as we come to a close here, what kind of final thoughts would you leave for the audience? What do you want
You
people
know,
to be thinking about?
it's a really exciting time in aerospace. It's dynamic. It's scary in some ways, as
Oh,
exciting times always are, but it is an exciting one. As mentioned, I really enjoy going out to college campuses and
mhm,
speaking to undergrads. And I feel like for most of the past decade, at least, I've been able to tell students I'm jealous of when they are graduating because
mhm.
they're entering a workforce where there are so many more options.
Right.
At the time I
Yeah.
entered the workforce, probably at the time you entered the workforce, there was cool stuff happening. There were cool people doing it, but there weren't that many choices. There weren't that
Sure.
many badges that you could wear.
Yeah.
And now any size of company, any workplace culture that you
Mhm.
want, any type of vehicle, any
Any
destination,
location.
technology, any
Yeah.
location, there's somebody doing it.
Yeah.
And there's high attrition. Not all those ideas are going to work. I've
Right.
been in a company that went bankrupt like that. That's going to happen to people, or that can
Yeah.
happen to people depending on the choices that you make. But even in those things, as with any other tech field, like there's lessons to be learned, there's experiences to be had, there's positive experiences to be had, even in really trying sort of circumstances like that. So I hope people will embrace the good side of that dynamism.
Yeah.
I know this past year added a whole nother layer of churn to that with a complicated election and question marks about a NASA budget and
Yeah.
about an administrator. But now, thankfully, we got a budget at NASA. We got an administrator
Yeah.
at NASA. There's a sense of urgency at NASA that I think is more than I've seen in a while. Not to
Mm.
denigrate past folks, but we really
Sure.
ramped it up in a way that I think is really, really positive. So I hope people get
Yeah.
amped about that. We should acknowledge the fear and the downside of that. Like, it's important to have your eyes open to those things, but I
Right.
think the upside to me really outweighs the downside on that.
Well, I really like that that theme to end on. It has been a crazy year, and it does seem like most of the ships are moving in the same direction.
Amen to that.
Yeah. So hopefully, if we do this again a year from now, we can say that actually happened. But on that note, I think we will call this episode. This has been the Space Madness podcast, and I really want to thank you, Will, for a great, fascinating discussion. I hope. No, I don't. I'm sure we will. We will not wait 10 years more to check in again. And thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'll look forward to part two.
All right. Thanks, everybody.